Thank you. Okay, so I'm glad to be here with you today. But before we get started with anything, would you give each of the girls one of these sheets, please? The sheet that Amy is passing out um, is a posting that I saw on Facebook, and it said, Rosa sat so Ruby could walk, so Kamala could run. And I thought that was very fitting for the times because I don't know, do you all know anything about Rosa Parks? Have you ever heard of Rosa Parks? Okay. So you know that Rosa sat on the bus, and we think of her as being the mother of the civil rights movement. Ruby, do you know Ruby Bridges? Okay, so Ruby was the first little girl to integrate schools in Alabama, was
Louisiana.
it? Louisiana. And then Kamala Harris is our current vice president. So I just wanted to share that with you just for context, so that you would have some idea, if you didn't already, of the history of civil rights. And you can read that whenever you have time. So the celebration of Black History Month began as Negro History Week, and that was created in 1926 by Carter G. Woodson, a noted African American historian, scholar, educator, and publisher. It became a month-long celebration in 1976. But personally, I think Black history should be taught all year long. It's not just a history in itself, but it's part of history. So therefore, I think it should be taught all year. So I think it's appropriate that Mrs. Christian invited me to speak to your group today, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's certainly my pleasure to be here. So I want to share some experiences that happened over 60 years ago. Now, I know to you all that seems ancient, and it probably is, but that's what I'm going to share. A little bit about the history of the sit-in movement, and then some of the things that I participated in 60 years ago. So we're talking about sitting down to take a stand against something. Do you know what a sit-in or a sit-down is? Okay, great. All right. So that's direct action that involves one or more people occupying an area for a protest, often to promote political, social, or economic change. And I'm glad that you're familiar with that. The protesters gather conspicuously in a space or a building, refusing to move unless their demands are met. So during the Indian struggle for independence from the British, followers of Gandhi's teaching employed the sit-in to great advantage. And it was the nonviolent movement that Gandhi believed in. A tactic similar to the sit-in or the sit-down strike has been used by unions to occupy plants of companies that they were on strike against. The first sit-in was used on a large scale in the United States during the United Automobiles Workers strike against General Motors in 1937. An early anti-segregation sit-in was staged by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, at a Chicago coffee shop in 1942, and then similar demonstrations took place around the South. Now, the sit-in movement, or the nonviolent movement in the United States civil rights era, began in Greensboro, North Carolina. Did you all know that? Okay.
Have you ever been to Greensboro?
Okay. The sit-in was a tactic that aroused sympathy for the demonstrators among moderates and uninvolved individuals. The sit-in at the lunch counter of Woolworth's department store. Have you ever heard of a Woolworth store?
Really?
Oh, okay. All right, so Woolworths are no longer around, I think. But they sat in at the counter of Woolworth's department store in Greensboro on February 1st, 1960. It was the stimulus for the larger sit-in movement that spread across the country. There were 4 Black students from Agriculture and Technical College of North Carolina, which is now called NC-A&T State University. They made some purchases at the local F.W. Woolworth department store. Then they sat down at the whites only white people could sit at the lunch counter, and placed an order, but they were refused service. They remained seated and were eventually asked to leave the premises. Instead, they stayed until the store closed. Now, one of the students later acknowledged that the group had previously talked about Gandhi's nonviolent movement, and they had thought about taking some action against the Jim Crow laws, but the sit-in that day was kind of spur of the moment, something that they did. Do you all know what the Jim Crow laws are? Have you ever heard of Jim Crow? Okay. The Jim Crow laws were laws that enforced racial segregation in the South. So the next day after they sat in, the sit-in grew to include more than 20 participants, including women from the neighboring Bennett College and 3 white female students from the Women's College of the University of North Carolina. The students were harassed and heckled by white patrons, but they remained at the counter and didn't fight back. The next day, more than 60 people joined the sit-in, and local newspapers and news stations came to Woolworth's to report the event. On February 4th, more than 300 students participated in the sit-in, which expanded to the lunch counter at the nearby Crest department store. After that, Woolworths decided that they were willing to negotiate. They were tired of all these people coming in, but they only made small token changes. The students resumed their sit-ins, the city adopted more stringent segregation policies, and 45 students were arrested and charged with trespassing. The students were so enraged by this that they launched a massive boycott of stores with segregated lunch counters. Interest in participating in the sit-in spread quickly among the students of North Carolina A&T. Because there were so many college students in the area, it made the sit-in very effective. As demonstrators were arrested, other people would come and take their places at the lunch counter, even though the counters were closed. So it was just a constant influx of students who came. Soon as word about the Greensboro movement spread across the Upper South, African American students from other historically black campuses began their own protests in places such as Salisbury, North Carolina, San Antonio, Texas, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. Local officials and business owners agreed to desegregate their facilities after the local sit-in movements took hold. Sales dropped by a third, forcing the store owners to give in. The Woolworths in Greensboro lost a reported $200,000 due to boycotts, and that was a lot of money in 1960. And on July 25th, 1960, 6 months after the first sit-in, the store manager decided to desegregate the store. So he asked 4 of the black employees from the store to take off their uniforms, go to the counter, and order. And so they did, and they were served. And so that day, those 4 employees became the first black people to be served at any Woolworth's lunch counter. The 4 freshmen from A&T also returned and were served. Now those seats and the counter remain in the original building in Greensboro, which is now part of the International Civil Rights Center and Museum. So at some point, if you'd like to visit that museum, it's still there. Now, key to the success of the sit-in movement was the moral high ground that the participants took. Their peaceful demonstrations for basic legal rights and respect increased favorable public opinion of their cause. Facing violent with nonviolent resistance required that the students take no action against the white aggressors and the police who physically harassed them and assaulted them and arrested them on bogus charges. Student participants came to understand the higher moral purpose of their movement, and they practiced those principles in hundreds of small encounters across the upper and middle South. Knowledge of the sit-in movement spread rapidly across the South as local nonviolent action took on a regional character. So by the end of February 1960, the lunch counter sit-ins had occurred in North Carolina, in South Carolina, Tennessee, Maryland, Kentucky, Alabama, Virginia, and Florida. They spread in March to Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Georgia, and later to West Virginia, Ohio, Oklahoma, Illinois, Kansas, and Missouri. An article published by Ella Baker crystallized the message of the students when she stated that those who participated in the sit-in movements were concerned with something bigger than a hamburger. She summed up their goals by quoting a student newsletter in the historically black Barbara Scotia College in Concord, North Carolina. And the article said, "We want the world to know that we no longer accept the inferior position of second-class citizenship. We're willing to go to jail, be ridiculed, spat upon, and even suffer physical violence to obtain first-class citizenship." The sit-in movement produced a new sense of pride and power for African Americans. By rising up on their own and achieving substantial success protesting against segregation in the society in which they lived, blacks realized that they could change the communities in which they lived. For many white Southerners, the sit-in movement demonstrated the blacks' dissatisfaction with the status quo and showed that economic harm could come to white-owned businesses unless they desegregated peacefully. So you might say, well, why did you participate in it? Why did I do it? I participated in sit-ins because I felt it was a moral obligation to try to change my community. I was in the 10th grade in 1960 when several of the students from Unity High School decided to mimic the activities that had occurred in Greensboro and other parts of the country. Now, I heard about the sit-ins when I attended mass rallies held at a local church in Statesville, and I was sure that I wanted to participate when the opportunity arose because we could shop at Woolworth's, but of course we couldn't buy anything at the lunch counter. And I thought it was wrong to discriminate against me just because I was black. I go back to the mass rallies. You all have Facebook and Twitter and all kinds of things to make connections now. So when the Black Lives Matter protest occurred, they used Facebook and other things to arrange the meetings so that everybody knew where to meet. We didn't have those kinds of things at that point. And so what we had were the NAACP meetings and the rallies, and that's where we planned what we were going to do because we didn't have the communication. There were no cell phones, believe it or not. We didn't have a cell phone or anything like that to communicate. So that's just how we did it. So at the time in 1960, we had 4 student teachers at Unity. 2 of them attended Livingstone College, and 2 of them were from Barbara Scotia College in Concord. So they demonstrated at the local F.W. Woolworth store that was downtown, and the Woolworth store was on South Center Street, near the square, near where Center and Broad Street intersect. So they went and protested at the Woolworth store, and then they were sent back to their college without finishing their student teaching because the school superintendent put pressure on our principal, who was Mr. Campbell, pressured him to get those students out of town, he said, for their safety. But after we saw the demonstrations in Greensboro, we saw our student teachers demonstrating, then we decided to organize our own sit-ins. So after school, we caught the bus downtown and went to the local Woolworth store.
And this is just in Statesville, everybody. Just
Yeah.
straight up the road.
Right,
You
right.
guys know where the clock tower is in Statesville?
Statesville?
Yes,
Yeah, like if you drive into Statesville and you see the clock tower and there's a Groucho's
Yeah.
right there,
Mhm.
that's where we're talking about. So this isn't
Right.
like far away. This is 15 miles down the road.
right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we organized our own demonstrations, and I was the youngest one of all in the bunch, but they let me go along anyway because I was insistent on participating. Mr.
15?
1960, yeah.
Wow.
15 years old.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Mr. Campbell, our principal, couldn't approve our actions, but he quietly, very quietly, helped us get to town so that we could demonstrate. If he had openly assisted us, he could have lost his job. So we went. Of course, service was refused to us, just like all the other students. I'd like to share some of the thoughts of the editor from the Statesville Record and Landmark newspaper. The Down in Iredell column was the editorial page, and this column appeared on April 2nd, 1960. It was the day after we had gone downtown to sit in. And it says, "But these lunch counter sit-ins are something else again. They advance nobody's education nor provide any new opportunities. They have as yet no legal standing. They carry no wide moral appeal. They are, in fact, simply a case of the blind leading the blind up a blind alley." During the early days, I'm still quoting, "During the early days of the school integration crisis, we heard a lot about preserving order and the supreme law of the land. Now these sit-in demonstrators no longer mention these matters, for the law is not on their side, but they resort to such glib phrases as human rights over property rights. They're joined in this approach by a few misguided ministers and college professors who never outgrew being sophomores." He adds, "We have great admiration and respect for the Negro citizens of Iredell County. We have found them to be good employees and good neighbors. We hate to see them duped by a few leaders bent on taking them farther and farther down the road from which there is no return." So you get an idea of how he felt. How did I feel? Well, I felt we were all really scared because we didn't know what was going to happen when we went downtown. We were willing to take a chance, but we were all really, really scared. No one participated in a sit-in of this sort without seriousness of purpose. The instructions were simple: sit quietly and wait to be served. We were jeered and threatened by local people, and angry onlookers tried to provoke a fight that never came. If we had been physically attacked, we were taught to curl up in a ball on the floor and take the punishment. Any violent reprisal would undermine the spirit of nonviolence of the sit-ins. When the local police came to arrest us, we went peacefully, but not without some comments, obviously. And so the Statesville Record and Landmark news article that reported on the demonstrations the day after said, and I'm quoting this article, 8 young Negroes will be given hearings in city court April 11th on charges which were brought against them yesterday during the latest sit-down demonstration at F.W. Woolworth Company here. 3 other Negroes, all under 16, were also arrested but released to the custody of their parents and will appear in juvenile court. Yesterday's demonstration was the 4th in a series of lunch counter protests which started here in early March, but no arrests had been made until yesterday. The 11 Negroes, myself included, faced charges of trespassing and abusing the police officer. Police Chief Ivy said this morning, the trespassing charge was brought when the Negroes refused to give their seats up at the variety store's lunch counter after the counter was closed. The abuse charges followed the students' refusal to heed the officer's advice and leave, and remarks which were made to the officers while they were investigating the demonstration. Chief Ivy said the demonstration began shortly after 4 p.m. when the Negroes, following a usual pattern, entered the store and sat down at the lunch counter. Chief Ivy, assisted by Captain Lackey and Lieutenant Pearson, went to the scene to help avoid violence. Shortly after the counter was closed to service, the officers said the Negroes refused to leave. Then the 11 were then arrested and 8 were jailed in lieu of $300 bond each. The Negroes, who all told officers they were students, remained in jail until 11:15 p.m. when TV Mangum posted $2,400 cash bonds for their appearance in court. In addition to the 11 who were arrested, Chief Ivy noted that 2 other students, a boy and a girl, followed them to the county jail and said they wanted to be locked up with the others. There was a trial held and the judge entered a prayer for judgment. Students went to court April 11, 1960, and again in 1963 before the case was finally dismissed in 1965. Eventually, they did remove the lunch counter from the store in Statesville. Now, in addition to that, I remembered how we had to go up the fire escape to sit in the balcony of the Playhouse Theater that used to be in Statesville. So when sit-ins occurred at the Capitol Theater in Salisbury, as a student at Livingstone College, I was there, always in it. During those times and after the civil rights legislation and the voting rights that the late Representative John Lewis fought so hard for, I never thought that we would be in the current situation that we're in today, that we face today. Surely we thought that America had realized its full potential. So the video that you saw and that you may watch later, the video showed some footage from Black Lives Matter marches last summer. So while a lot has changed since the 1960s, Black people today in America are still faced with many of the systemic challenges and forms of oppression that existed decades ago. And the sit-ins and Black Lives Matter are very similar. Both movements focused on racism and injustice, and both have been spearheaded by young people. The Greensboro 4, those 4 students who sat in, were 17 years old at the time of their historic arrest. On June 6th last year, the Black Lives Matter March was organized by an 18-year-old. Perhaps people around that age or younger, like me, often hope they're capable of making a difference in the world. There were 2 significant differences between the movements, however. It was plain to see what was happening in 1960. We knew we couldn't sit at the lunch counter, so that was something you could see. And we tackled the Jim Crow laws that segregated Black people and denied us the right to have the same opportunities as white Americans. That legal system of Jim Crow may not be in place today, but Black Americans are still affected by racial disparities in health care, education, wealth, and the criminal justice system. Although racism and oppression may be more subtle now, you know it's there. You still know it's there. And as I said, the other key difference is social media, which has made it easier to spread information and organize protests of like-minded people. When you think about the events last summer with Black Lives Matter, you'll see that those protests were not sit-ins, but they did serve the same purpose. They came about because people of all races saw a moral injustice and wanted to do something about it. So, in closing, just let me say to you all, you young ladies, stand up for what you believe, because you can introduce and inspire major changes in society. I encourage you to be open-minded and willing to hear each other out. Stay calm in the face of adversity and be respectful to all people. And always try to build coalitions between races as an effective tool in ending discrimination. Get to know people of different races. And I know sometimes that's difficult because sometimes your school doesn't allow that and you don't interact with people of other races. But as much as you can, try to get to know people of other races and understand their cultures. And as the late Representative Lewis said, if you see an injustice, speak out. Thank you.